Full Credit to the News is brought to you by Authentic Collectables. Hello and welcome to Full Credit to the News, brought to you by Authentic Collectables. I'm Andrew Van Leeuwen, and this week I'm not joined by Stefan Bartholomaeus, who has come down crook after a big week in Melbourne. So instead I have the great honour of welcoming the man known by his adoring fans as the Chipmunk, Speedcafe's news editor, Simon Chapman. You're on the pod for the very first time. Simon, thanks for joining me. You're actually facing upright this week. That's quite surprising.
Yeah, thanks for having me. For the listeners who don't know, I had a little whoopsie in the passenger seat of a rally car, and found the world facing the wrong way, which was a bit of fun.
That's one way to describe it, I suppose. Probably fun that you got out of it unscathed. Let's say that much. Well, look, it's been another pretty big week of news in Australian motorsport. Some more political shuffling in the world of supercars manufacturers, a bit of engine news, and plenty more. Let's start by dipping into this, I guess, renewed sort of rivalry between Ford and GM at the moment. It's a bit of a Royal Rumble, to be perfectly honest. Now, since the last time we did one of these news pods, we broke the news that Triple Eight was looking to enforce a year-long pause on Jeremy Moore's move to GM, by which I mean ensuring that he sees out both his 6-month notice period and his 6-month non-compete before taking up that role. So unless he's bought out of his contract by GM, he may not be able to start there until March 2026, which I guess would be a little bit of a win for the Ford camp. Now, there's another little potential win that could be on the cards for Ford, and that is this bit of interest in the Dark Horse Mustang. Now, the homologated supercar is currently the Mustang GT, and Supercars won't be letting homologated cars in the wind tunnel later this year, only unhomologated cars, i.e. the Supra. But the thinking is that Triple Eight will want its chance to put its little stamp on the Mustang once it formally becomes the homologation team, and that could happen by Ford declaring it wants to change its Supercars model from the GT to the Dark Horse, which it runs in NASCAR. It's a minor facelift, but it may open the door for rehomologation. And boom, the Mustang is in the wind tunnel. Here's what Ford's global motorsport boss had to say about it at Albert Park on Sunday.
TBD, honestly, right? I mean, at this point, we're committed to, we have to race the Mustang GT for this year. No decisions beyond that. But if and when it makes sense, either for competition reasons or for marketing reasons to change it, then we'll change it.
Interesting that he actually says the word competition there, Simon. Am I alone on this podcast right now thinking that there's a very real chance we'll see Ford make this Dark Horse move?
I think it's an interesting one. Like when Ford first announced that it was going to basically put the Mustang in all these different categories. Obviously there was GT4, they've got their own one-make series, NASCAR and GT3 racing, and Supercars and the GT3 car, maybe to a lesser extent, were the only two that weren't the Dark Horse, which was odd. And it didn't really come with any real explanation either, especially considering, just generally speaking in motorsport, a lot of the time these manufacturers like to use their flagship product or at least their highest level car, I guess, in their suite of models and things. So yeah, it was a little bit surprising that they didn't go from that from the outset. Like the Ford and supercar, like the Mustang, as we know, has already gone through a couple of iterations. They obviously tried to do the S550, now they've got the S560 or 650. So yeah, it's a funny one, but I guess the question is why? Why do we need to do this? We've already got enough headaches going on with the engine dramas, let alone having to stick a facelift Mustang back into a wind tunnel and potentially open up another can of worms and say, oh geez, now this thing's got heaps of downforce, for example, or whatever happens. Just as like a little side note to all that, it's actually interesting looking at the front end of the Camaro versus the current Mustang, and they are actually quite different looking things, and the philosophy in terms of how I guess you would traditionally make your downforce with a splitter is noticeably quite different aesthetically. So I guess maybe from that point of view, maybe it wouldn't be too much of a drama, but again, hard to know.
I think, when you come back to the why, it would just be because it's what Triple Eight wants to do. You know, they are the homologation team. We want this to be the Triple Eight Mustang, even if it's the tiniest little change. But you're certainly right. It would be interesting to open the door to more headaches regarding parity and all that sort of stuff. But I certainly have a feeling we're going to see a few of them with the Supra anyway, as much as we've improved the practices and all that sort of stuff. I think it's very ambitious to think that the Supra will just roll out and everything will be just fine and everyone's going to go car racing and have nothing to complain about. While we're on the subject of homologation and parity matters, there is some interesting news out there about Supercars upgrading its own dyno facilities as well. And that's because of these niggling question marks around the Ford V8 motor. Because it kind of doesn't feel like, in the way that I think the aero testing answered a lot of questions about the aero and the bodywork, the transient dyno testing that was done offshore last year hasn't seemed to have properly flushed out all the issues between the two motors. So Supercars has actually been upgrading its own dyno so that it can do some barometric work and everyone can properly understand what effect the altitude at Bathurst is having on the quad cam Ford. And not the altitude of Mount Panorama, the altitude of Bathurst itself. There is a theory out there that does affect the quad cam motor more than the push rod motor, and that is why we haven't seen Fords be overly competitive at Bathurst for the last 2 years. So, I mean, this is critically important for Supercars because having parity everywhere except Bathurst is just not good enough. Like, this is the one race where everyone needs to have a chance of winning.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, part of the fundamental flaw with this engine architecture, right, is that we've got these two different styles of engine, whereas in the past it's just been like 5 litres, build it, and that's what it's going to be. And I even remember back to the very early days of the Gen 3 concept and, you know, chatting to some of the bigwigs, some of which are no longer involved in that sort of process, and they were all just like, oh no, an engine's an engine, like it'll be happy days, we'll figure it out. And now we're kind of at that point now where we're kind of starting to realize that, okay, maybe these engines are actually quite different from each other in terms of how they make their speed. There's a bit of chat that like the Ford has better corner exit, and then the Chevy's obviously got the better top end because it's got so much straight line on the Ford. And I do wonder whether you might have even seen that a little bit at Albert Park. You might be able to speak to that a little bit as well, because that's a very high speed circuit now that it's got those super, I guess, long radius corners on it and the long stretches too. You know, like last year when we were going through some of those headaches, I got shown some of the footage of just the Chevys walking away from the Fords. Now, the problem isn't as bad as what it used to be, but it was maybe evidenced a little bit even this year that still the Chevy's got a lot of top end.
Yeah, so Albert Park was a weird one because obviously the Mustangs weren't super competitive there, and there were drivers talking about engine performance. There was a theory doing the rounds, I think it was on about Saturday morning, actually it was Saturday because it was the very hot day, because I walked all the way over to the Supercars paddock to investigate this, that it was something to do with the curbs, the sawtooth curbs, like actually putting the cam timing out a little bit. I had a chat with Brendan McGinniskin from Ford about that. He didn't seem to think that was a specific issue, that it was more just a continuation of the general performance deficit that there has been, between the motors at certain circuits. It's weird that we didn't see it at all at Sydney Motorsport Park with this big long straight and all that sort of stuff. But you know, as you say, Grand Prix is just so high speed now, it is just still this niggling issue. It's the one thing we haven't fully got on top of. And as you talked about, we've got these different types of engines, and the Toyota is a quad cam as well. So it's something that, you know, particularly in the guise of Bathurst, like Toyota is coming to Supercars to win Bathurst. Like Sean Hanley has been very clear about that. So it is something that needs to be dealt with in terms of Bathurst, so that all three manufacturers feel like they're going to go to Mount Panorama each year and have a chance of actually winning the Bathurst 1000.
Yeah, and that's going to be an even bigger headache that they've got to figure out. You know, is once this Toyota turns up, depending on where we end up racing at the start of next year, you know, it might be that we race on a street circuit, it might be that we're somewhere totally different. But yeah, Toyota are coming to win, and it'll probably be easier for Supercars to, you know, if the Toyota turns up and wins Bathurst, like there's probably not going to be much in the way of complaining going on, but we're just adding another.
Oh, they'll be complaining.
Complexity, yeah.
They'll be complaining.
from Supercars, I'm not sure, but yeah, it'll be Yeah, it'll be interesting. It's just fascinating that, you know, we managed to get through sort of the Gen 2 era with like little bits and pieces of parody chat, but nothing as prolonged as this. Like it's been amazing how long, like literally from the inception of Gen 3, they've had something parody related. And yeah, I guess when you reflect on when we get to the end of this era, whenever that's going to be, maybe the problem was having the different displacements. It's just interesting that we maybe are hyper analytical as opposed to some other categories. You know, like speak to Shane Van Gisbergen, and he says that they do have parity issues in NASCAR, for example, but it's all kept like behind closed doors, and we never really hear about it. You can actually kind of see it in the racing sometimes, because there was this period where Ford just had like absolutely no luck for a long time, but that was probably parity related. It's, you know, whether or not it's a good thing for the sport that it's so public that we speak about parity is an interesting topic in itself, I think.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is actually based around the fact that the cars are so similar. That's really what it comes down to. The cars are so similar. We don't have the team disparity that covered up car disparity anymore, and everything just seems so obvious when it's not quite right. So that's what we've been dealing with.
And it's interesting too, isn't it? Because Rushbrook said we don't want to be going to circuits where one car has an inherent advantage or a disadvantage, which is fair, because you don't want to have, you know, 4 races where you know that you can be competitive, but the other, you know, 8 or 9, you're not gonna be in the fight.
Yeah, no, and that is what we've kind of seen in the more recent sort of past in supercars, that you do have, you know, certain tracks that suit certain cars, but the one where you just can't have that is Bathurst. It's the one. It just can't happen. Everyone has to have a shot there. So, yeah, look, this beefing up of the dyno is just work that absolutely has to be done to try and get some answers about whether this, you know, whether there are these atmospheric differences or these factors that are playing into the fact that we haven't seen the Mustangs be super competitive at Bathurst. So, all very interesting. Well, let's take a quick moment to hear from William Hall at Authentic Collectables.
Thanks, AVL. Here at Authentic, we're continuing our run of announcing our 2025 V8 Supercars in both 1/18th and 1/43rd scale. In the last few weeks, we've announced our Walkinshaw Andretti United Mustangs of Ryan Wood and Chaz Mostert, our Team 18 Chevrolet Camaros of Anton De Pasquale and David Reynolds, and just recently we've announced the Brad Jones Racing Camaros driven by Andre Heimgartner, Macaulay Jones and Bryce Forward, which is in the vibrant Shaw livery from the Melbourne Super Sprint. To get your hands on these or any of our 2025 V8 Supercar announcements, be sure to get to your local Authentic Collectibles stockist, or you can register your interest on our website at authenticcollectibles.com.au. Now, back to AVL.
Thank you, William. Now, Simon, I'm interested to get your take on the driving standards debate that has got the supercars paddock up and about right now. I did sum up my thoughts on Full Credit to the Noise earlier this week, but I wanted to surmise them again a little bit with a bit more clear air, because there was a lot going on the Sunday evening of the Grand Prix, and obviously it had been a very long week and all that sort of stuff. So without sounding like I'm Beardo's PR man, I just want to reiterate that I do like what he's trying to do, and I'm still surprised that there is this ongoing theory that penalties should never be outcome-based, because that's basically how any judicial system works. The outcome of your actions will determine the severity of the penalty. I mean, if you're speeding down a public road and you crash into someone and their car is damaged, you're going to lose your license and cop a fine. If you do the same thing and someone gets seriously hurt in the process, you're probably going to go to jail. So it's the same action with different outcomes and therefore different penalties. So I don't fully understand where this outrage is coming from various segments of the driver group about how dare these penalties ever be based on outcome. Those are my thoughts. Simon, where do you sit on all of this? And it's particularly fascinating for you, given that it's all centered around this massive Kiwi showdown between Beardo and SVG and Scotty Mack and Ryan Wood.
Yes, but I'm a journalist, so I am impartial. So they say. Yeah, no, I think it's interesting. There's absolutely nothing wrong with there being, you know, outcome-based penalties. You constantly hear drivers hark on about like the severity of penalties and not getting a penalty that's severe enough when you're on the receiving end of it. So, you know, for Woody to get a drive-through penalty, for example, for taking someone out of the race, that's actually probably like not too bad, all things considered. You get sent to the back of the field, and you do still have an opportunity to, if there's a safety car, for example, to come back through. Like that's just motorsport, and it's the same in rugby and other codes. Like if you have a head high tackle on someone and the bloke's been knocked out, well then you get red carded. If there's something egregious, but there's mitigating factors, then they'll give you a yellow card, and that's exactly what we're seeing in supercars now. So I don't have any problems with the way that we're penalising at the moment. It'll be interesting to see how it is moving forward, because it still feels like we're very early into this new style of disciplining drivers, and also we saw that in one of the races there that the officials waited until after the race to hand Chaz Mostert a penalty on James Golding, which was interesting in itself because that one looked like a bit of a slam dunk. But you can also argue that there was a hell of a lot going on in that race just in general. So, like, forgive them if they can't make a decision in the space of 14 or 19 laps, because those races at Albert Park are unusual in that you don't actually get a lot of time to digest what's happening, and it's, I think, a net positive because everyone's talking about it. Like everyone is talking about it. Anyone who is interested in supercars is talking about how good the racing is, and the penalties are maybe like a little bit of an aside to that. That's just kind of a natural consequence of it, and it all goes way back to Shane Van Gisbergen and Will Brown having that nose to tail at SMP, and people being upset about how that was officiated, because under the new rules, not that there's anything written in black and white, that just wouldn't have been an issue in the past. And drivers have been saying ever since then, that we should be having a more lenient approach. Like Will Brown is like the king of I absolutely parked the car in the middle of the corner to try and get a penalty out of Shane, and he got it. But that just wouldn't happen now, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, the flip side is we have a system where any contact has to be penalised regardless of outcome, which means penalties for nothing, and it means that Saturday night finish in Sydney would never have happened. So I guess it's a be careful what you wish for sort of scenario in this case as well. Well, we've got a bit of a wait until the next Supercars round as the cars bob their way across the Tasman on a boat. But F1 is straight back into it with China this weekend. Simon, as our resident Kiwi, I'm guessing you have eyes on Liam Lawson this weekend and how he responds to what was a bit of a shocker in Melbourne.
Yeah, poor old Liam. Just as far as like a Red Bull debut goes, it probably doesn't get much worse than that. Obviously, we can see that the McLaren is the car to beat at the moment, and the Red Bull is maybe not far behind it. But then when you see Liam all the way down in plumb last, I think it was, in at least one of the sessions, doesn't make for good reading, and it certainly doesn't help anyone who's pro Perez, for example. Like, if you're a Liam Lawson fan, just stay out of the comments at the moment. But when he goes to China, it's not going to be any easier, because that weekend's a sprint weekend. So I think he gets like 60 minutes of practice on Friday, and I'm sure he'll just be pounding around getting as many laps as possible, and then he goes straight into a qualifying session. So it's going to be interesting to see how he handles that pressure. Good racing car drivers. That's the reality. Red Bull have obviously picked him because they think he's good enough and can do the job. So it's definitely not going to be an easy weekend in China, but he's got a couple of good chances in the sprint and the Grand Prix to maybe bank some points. If he can come out of the weekend with points, that's probably a win. Because that car is competitive. We know that car is competitive, but he will, I'm sure, be wanting to be as close to Max, or like even well inside the top 10 if possible.
Yeah, absolutely. It was. We know how brutal the Red Bull system can be because we saw Dr. Helmut Marko literally saying that one of his other drivers who crashed out on the warm-up lap for his first ever Grand Prix crying was embarrassing. So if you wanted to sit down and write an F1 villain character for a movie, you'd actually struggle to make him quite as evil as Dr. Helmut Marko kind of feels like he is.
He's literally got one eye. Like he's already fulfilling one of the stereotypes in that sense. I think Liam will probably be happy that Marco's come out with comments like that, because it probably takes the heat off him a little bit.
Yeah, I guess so. But yeah, wow, what a statement to make when the poor kids obviously had a bit of a shocker in very tough conditions. But yeah, it's good. I don't know, I kind of like it that that F1's back sort of again this weekend. You know, it's fun to sort of start the momentum and then have a bit more on track action. So that will be very interesting. Now, talking about back-to-back Grand Prix weekends, I guess, let's finish up with a listener question we had, which was from Phil Martin, who said, another publication posted a story about next year's Supercars Grand Prix round being a 2-weekender with the first weekend for Supercars at Albert Park and the second for F1, obviously. Phil said, I think it's a brilliant idea. Will it happen? What are your thoughts? I've got bad news for you on a couple of fronts, Phil. One, that's absolutely not a thing that's under discussion with the Australian Grand Prix Corporation or by Supercars or anyone. So certainly don't book your tickets to Albert Park a week early next year, because all you'll be watching is a bunch of people setting up a racetrack, because there won't be any racing on. So yeah, look, I had a chat with Hayden Lane, who's the head of comms at the AGPC today. It's not something that has been discussed at all. It's not something they're looking at. They actually can't do it. So the Grand Prix Act means they have access to the circuit for 7 days and 7 days only. I think that's something that they would like to change, in terms of it would make the bump in and bump out of the circuit easier if it was closed off to the public earlier. So not necessarily about doing more racing. So even if, you know, so they actually can't do it. So it's not under discussion, because why would you discuss something that you legally cannot actually do? Even if they could, it's not something they would do, and Supercars would have to be absolutely insane to entertain the idea of it, because you would suddenly go from racing in front of 400,000 people across 4 days to probably, I don't know, maybe 100,000 people. So you'd cut your crowd in a quarter. So go explain that to your sponsors and ask them to pay the same amount of money. It doesn't matter where you are in pit lane or whatever. So it actually would make zero sense for Supercars. The optics of it would be horrendous for Supercars when you have one weekend of quarter full grandstands and the next weekend of this absolutely pumping, heaving event. So no, not something that's under consideration, not something that would happen in the way that it has been reported it could happen. It's absolutely, like, so yeah, not a thing. I'm sure that the AGPC could see a benefit in one day expanding the event to being bigger and better than it already is. But it wouldn't, I don't think it would ever be led by Supercars. It might be some other sort of thing they could do on the other weekend in terms of, you know, utilising the track if they could get it closed off earlier. Maybe there's room to bring in more support categories and do a bit like what Macau did a couple of years ago with just a pure support weekend that wouldn't even, that has the lower level categories, and then you come in with the bigger categories. But Supercars would want to be on that big weekend, because the optics of not doing that and the please explain that you get from your sponsors would be far insurmountable, basically. So yes, it was an interesting thing to see, but there doesn't seem to be absolutely any truth to it whatsoever.
Yeah, we did Super Bathurst once, and I think we're all still a bit scarred from that too.
There's been a few super events over the well, we did a couple of Super Bathurst really, because we had the 12-hour season opener last year as well. So there's been a few of those, and not to mention a few back-to-back SMPs and a few things over the last few years that yeah, you're right. Maybe we don't need that. Anyway, before we finish up, I just want to say time is running out to get your ticket for the Ultimate Indy 500 prize worth $20,000. That includes a trip to this year's Indy 500, driver meet and greet, and a whole host of stuff. So I think it ends on Monday for that. So $20 to get a ticket. So if you head to speedcafe.com, there's a little tab right near the top that says win a trip to the Indy 500. Jump on there and get your tickets. It all goes to St Vincent's in Sydney, so it's for a really good cause. It's all for charity. So make sure you get amongst that before you miss out altogether. That will do us for now. Follow Speedcafe for all the action from China and the Australian Rally Championship opener in Canberra over the weekend, as well as Trans Am and Aussie racing cars and a few other things going on. Full credit to the noise. We'll be back on Tuesday morning, and we'll see you then.